Hi, welcome to the episode of AWS for Retail and CPG, a series exploring how cloud technologies can transform the retail and CPG businesses. I am Sujata, Solutions Architect at AWS, and today I am joined by Greg Scheer, Solutions Architect Manager at AWS and working for the retail and the CPG customers. So Greg, thank you so much for joining us today. So before we get started, could you quickly introduce yourself and the work which you do with the retail and the CPG brands?
Hi there, yes. My name is Greg Scheer, Solutions Architect Manager in the retail and consumer goods industry. We actually subdivided into 4 sub-verticals: general merchandise, fashion apparel, grocery and consumer packaged goods, and we're going to focus on the latter in today's talk. My team partners with consumer goods brands to innovate through technology, and we solve problems across the board from supply chain through to consumer services and experiences. And it really energizes to me to see how we can use technology to transform the business for our customers and also drive positive environmental impact. Career-wise, I've spent just over 2 decades in the kind of sales arena, focused on multiple industries, if not all of them, including retail and CPG. So I've got a really good insight into the nuances of the industry.
Fantastic. So today we are exploring an inspiring story of innovation, how a leading CPG beverage company created a digital and touchless drink dispensing solution during the pandemic. And this is not just a technology story. It's a story about innovation. It's a story about sustainability and meeting the rapidly changing consumer expectations. The use case which we are going to discuss today not only solved the immediate challenges faced during the pandemic, but it also advanced the company's long-term goals, which we are going to discuss throughout our conversation today. So, Greg, before we dive deeper, I would love to understand the business context. So what challenges was this CPG company facing which led them to explore such an innovative solution?
Yeah, it was quite fascinating because when we started talking to this company, there was actually a multitude of problems they were trying to solve, challenges they were trying to solve, and you could have approached each of them independently of one another. But what we thought is to kind of pull them together, and I'll list them now. So the first one was sustainability targets. So, the use of single-use plastics, the impact on the environment, etc. There's a lot of pressure to change that. Now, that's a huge challenge for a company that's been doing supply chain around single-use plastics for years, but they had no choice. They had to do it. The second piece was the pandemic. Kind of coincided with the pandemic. So suddenly, people were really aware of using, shared surfaces when it comes to devices and beverage dispensers. So almost overnight, the good old beverage dispensing technology became obsolete. We had to think of a different way of dealing with that. The third was personalization, and it's actually been a trend for a long time now, but personalization, especially amongst the younger demographic, is absolutely key for them, having a really tailored experience to themselves. And lastly, and this is something that consumer packaged goods companies have always struggled a little bit with, is understanding their end consumer. Generally, the retailers have that relationship more closely than the consumer packaged good companies. So data was key on actually understanding their consumers. So traditional bottled beverages means that you basically have no relationship with the end consumer. Volumes of packages sold, but that's about it. So it was interesting. Again, I go back to what I started with. If we hadn't started with the working backwards mechanism that we use at Amazon, we would never have pulled those problems together and actually come up with the solution we're about to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. And as you mentioned about this collaboration began with Amazon's working backwards approach, where you start with the customer first, understand their requirements, the issues, you identify the root cause of the problem, and then you move backwards to the technology solution. And considering the multiple challenges which you described, like sustainability, pandemic, personalization, data gaps. So how did this customer-centric approach shape the overall business outcome rather than just creating another technology implementation?
Yeah, so when you work backwards from the end consumer, you're really forced to ask a series of questions. There's actually 5 of them. I'll try and list all of them. The first one is, who is the actual end customer? What is the problem you're trying to solve for them? What is the solution you're going to solve for them? And I'm going to forget one, but one of them is, How are you going to measure success? How are you going to make sure you're still on the right track? So once you've asked those kinds of questions, it really forces you to think about the problem you're trying to solve from their context, right? So the working backwards mechanism is what we call it, and the first step in that process is the working backwards workshop. And it's quite interesting because generally what you'd want from your customer, in this case this beverage company, what you need from them is their exec sponsorship. Execs need to be part of this. Now, anecdotally, I've sat through a number of these workshops, and generally, these leaders don't get the chance to sit in a room together and talk about innovation in the way that the working backwards process allows them to. Generally, they're dealing with business as usual, firefighting, fire drills, and all sorts of things like that, reactive in nature. So it's a great way for them to actually take a bit of time and really focus on that and actually take that forward into their business, their own business cadence anyway. And then from that workshop, there's an output, which is essentially what we call a peer FAQ, press release and frequently asked questions. And we write it together with the customer and those stakeholders from the perspective of a customer at some point in the future. So imagine if we were writing one now, it would be in 2027. We'd write from the context of someone actually reading that peer FAQ. So what it does is it actually forces you to really think from their perspective on what they'd like to see from your solution, right? And in that, you might include some, made-up customer quotes and anecdotes, for instance, just to drive the point home, and a little bit of data on how you're going to solve the solution. And once you've done that, it kind of equates to a vision, right? So the vision in this case was really a system for consumers to customize drinks through their smartphone, okay? But also to provide rich data on those consumers. And it really forced us to articulate the business problem. What does success look like from a business perspective rather than technology? So technology, great enabler, but if you start there, you start thinking about feeds and speeds and features and functions rather than actually what you're trying to solve. And lastly, I think once we had the vision, you kind of get three key takeaways from that. The first one is it keeps you focused on outcomes, not features, as I said before. It creates a really compelling story for your own teams, as those execs could go back to the business and really sell the story to them as far as the people who will help them deliver on this promise. And then it also provides really clear criteria for decision making going forward. So pretty important. You want to think about how you're going to make those decisions, how you're going to measure your success as you go forward. So only then did technology come into the fold. So that's really important. I've seen many companies start there and fail. So it's really important to start there.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. And thank you for explaining the working backwards approach and particularly writing the PR FAQ, understanding the vision and the outcomes and how it shaped the overall vision in this use case, right? Now, I'm curious about the actual implementation. So could you please walk us through the solution which was created and how cloud technology made this possible? So I would be interested in the architecture that connects the physical drink dispensing solution to the digital backend.
Yeah, sure. So I think I'll start off with this as really key for us to create a really elegant solution, a simple solution for the consumer. So we really needed to hide the complexity away from them. It needs to be really easy to do this, right? But it had a sophisticated backend, which is the cloud services I'll talk about in a minute. And as I said before, the system centers on the smart beverage tap, which users basically browse on a smartphone to dispense, and we gather a little bit of data. And I'll talk you through a kind of walkthrough of the experience from the end consumer's perspective. So a consumer approaches a tap, which could be a tap in any situation. It could be at a shopping mall or some sort of vendor. There's a QR code on the actual tap, which they open a web app to scan. There's no download, so that's quite nice. People don't want to have yet another app on their phone, which is great. They can then browse different preferences, make selections around still versus sparkling, etc. And then the tap dispenses a drink into whatever the vessel is that they have. But behind this is a very sophisticated cloud architecture, as I said before. And within the tap is a series of sensors, and those sensors are communicating in real time back to the cloud in a very secure fashion, mutual authentication, etc. So, security is job zero. We've got information around customers themselves traversing the situation, so we're going to make sure that that's a place we actually started with in the design. And as we say, the comms is in real time. The consumer request is transmitted securely, and instructions are sent specific to that tap into the cloud. Another thing that's quite useful for this is fleet management. If you think about reducing costs or being really efficient, on the original dispensers, you'd have to have a physical person to go and make changes there. With fleet management controlled from the cloud, you can make software updates, you can change the menu configuration, you can do maintenance, change the version of the firmware and so forth, all over the wire essentially. So it not only presents a new solution that they're actually looking for, but it reduces costs and presents improved flexibility. There's a few more points I'll make, which is benefits to venue owners. You have a really premium amenity supporting their sustainability goals. So a lot of these venues, they've got the same goals, right? They've got to have some sort of badge around what they're doing for the environment, and that's a benefit. But then for the beverage company, there was kind of three main transformative pieces that came from this. So the first one was a direct relationship, digital relationship with the end consumer, which never existed before. So it's a whole new kind of paradigm shift for these beverage companies. It helped with their sustainability angle, as we said before, reduced packaging and the impact on the environment. And then lastly, this is quite good for future-proofing because of the effort we put in place to actually have the cloud platform foundations ready for this new solution. Those foundations can also be used for future developments and innovations that use the cloud. So actually, the next time they come up with some sort of innovative idea, they're at a kind of head start. They've already got the foundations in place. So in a nutshell, reduces plastic waste, it enhances the consumer experience, and generates value. So this is really important. It kind of highlights that profit and purpose don't have to be two separate things, right? That you can actually focus on the two at the same time.
Exactly. Amazing. And the technical architecture you described is truly impressive. And one aspect which really stands out is the data opportunity it creates, right? So as you rightly mentioned, CPG companies, they have very limited direct consumer insights. Yeah. And this kind of solution, it's a kind of game changer, right? Yeah. So after this implementation, what kind of data insights is this company now able to gather, and how has it transformed the overall decision-making process with this new data stream?
Yeah, so I mean, it's transformed their ability to do everything with data. As I said before, there was no real. They had data around possibly their retailers, but nothing to do with their consumers. So that totally changed the game. So their understanding on consumer behavior just changed overnight, because they actually knew who the person was, their demographics, where they lived, geography, all sorts of information like that, which is useful, which then gives them kind of granular preference data, thinking about flavor combinations linked to demographic maybe, age group, generational information, preferences by location, how quickly consumers adopt new offerings, all sorts of things like that. And what it does then is actually accelerates marketing capability as well as product development, whereas before it's almost intangible how they did product development in the past without this kind of information. The other thing is real-time data collection enables trend adoption and identification. So before, trend analysis based on what the retailers told them about, whereas this is in real time seeing new trends. And then I've already spoken about the ability to affect product development and marketing, but also demand sensing. If you think about replenishment, making sure that there's enough stock wherever it is, because it's all running through the cloud, you have that data in real time on how soon you're going to run out of certain flavors and so forth, which was key for them. And the last point was continuous improvement loop. So if you think about, the more the system is used, the smarter it gets as more data is gathered and so forth. So it's kind of perpetual cycle of improvement.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. And the data insights are clearly, it's transformative, right? So now I would like to shift our focus to the actual implementation process. So based on my experience working with multiple companies, right, and customers, right? So I see that even the best technology solution, they can face challenges or struggles during the actual execution process. And particularly when you are taking an innovative concept from idea to production. So I'm sure you might have to go through a lot of organizational and technical hurdles, right? So what factors were critical for the successful implementation of this project?
Yeah, I think the first is definitely a non-technical absolute, which is exec sponsorship. So you need to have someone who's going to, champion this from the exec board. And in this case, it was a CEO. It's not always going to be the case. CEOs are very busy people, but at least one level down from the CEO who's going to champion this. And essentially what they're going to be doing is remove obstacles that teams normally face when there's no exec sponsorship to actually drive this idea forward. The second was, and also they'll be championing how much of a strategic priority this is. That's key to get teams behind the idea. The second is cross-functional collaboration, getting teams working together, which is dependent on the exec sponsorship in that strategic direction. In this case, we had teams including beverage scientists, we had hardware engineers that created the actual tap device. We had experts in the consumer interface, what does the actual web app look like? But then also cloud architects from AWS helping as part of that team to build that foundational platform as well. Thirdly was a focus on the overall experience, so not just cloud or not just the tap, but what's it actually going to look like to the consumer at the end of the day. So not just the technology, the team focused on things like the design of the cup holder, as they did with the technology. And what that meant is, overall for the consumer, it was a really premium experience throughout, from the app to the cup holder to everything was top notch, right? And then fourthly, we deployed to a select set of partners to begin with, including AWS and Amazon. So there's taps within our buildings that we could actually test and gather the data before we actually released it to the market, which was great. And then finally, this is the most important, is a simple onboarding process for new users, as I described before. And adoption rates soared to around 80% once we actually had this in place. So in the locations that we've installed to, so it's quite quickly we could see that there's a success of it.
Yeah, perfect. And the implementation factors which you outlined, definitely it gives a clear picture of what made this project successful, right? So as we wrap up this conversation, right, a last question here. So based on your experience working with many retail and CPG companies, what's one advice which you would like to give to the leaders or the executives who are considering similar digital transformation initiative? And how do you see solutions like this evolving in the future?
Yeah, so I've actually got a few points rather than just the one. So there's several lessons I'd say from this case study that apply to the industry, and probably not just this industry, but many industries. Sustainability and business growth are not opposing forces. I kind of alluded to it a little bit before. Quite often, organizations see sustainability as this checkbox they need to do. I think what organizations really need to think about is embedding that within their business cadence. As they drive things forward, it just becomes part of the way that they do business, because this definitely proved that value, right? These started with an environmental challenge, and actually it's driving business benefits through the data they never had and consumer insights and all sorts. The second is physical products and digital experience are converging, right? That's a standard thing. Creating experiences which the consumers care about today, especially the younger demographic. It's all about experience for them, right? Which is great. I say them because I'm not part of that demographic, as you can tell. And then data is valuable. Probably as from a business perspective, data is as valuable, if not more, than the actual solution we came up with. Because if you think about what we can do with that data, there's questions we don't even know we need to ask yet based on the data that we could do in the future, right? Which kind of speaks back to the innovation cycle. So that's important. And then this, as I said before a few times, business innovation precedes the technology innovation. If you start with the technology, you're generally not answering the question that the consumers really care about. So looking ahead, we're looking at ultra personalization. Again, linked to the demographic, absolutely one thing tailored to themselves. There's a blur between physical and digital retail, which is prevalent. Sustainability built directly into business models as opposed to separate. And then also the last point is as a service, right? So you can link subscription models and all sorts to these types of approaches, and as a service becomes, as you've seen with all sorts of other industries like media, it's quite a prevalent thing now, and it's becoming part of the retail landscape too. So I'll finish with this. The future success will be brands delivering exactly what consumers want, in a convenient and stable way, a sustainable way, which, by the way, is also a very important aspect for many of the demographics we spoke about before. And this shows innovation. We're already along that path.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for those incredible insights, Greg. So what's striking about this story is the convergence of multiple business imperatives, be it digital transformation, sustainability, personalization, data strategy, as you mentioned, all into a single elegant solution. And I really liked the way you highlighted that sustainability and business growth, they can work complementary rather than competing forces, right? And this use case, it's a clear example that companies don't need to choose between environmental responsibility and commercial success. So a thoughtful innovation can deliver both. So thanks for those insights. To the viewers, thanks for watching this conversation. I hope this has sparked some ideas on how cloud technologies can transform your own business while also meeting your sustainability requirements. Please subscribe to our channel for similar stories and insights on transforming the retail and CPG businesses. Until then, thanks for watching.